Let's compare Brother and Superba knitting machines. They may look very different and have different markings and notations, but actually the two can achieve almost the same things most of the time. I'll be working on my Brother 260 with River, which is a bulky machine, and on my Superba S48 double bed machine, which is a standard gauge machine. The things I'm showing you are generally true for many models. Let's do the tubular cast on. That's a double bed cast on, and we often begin with it because that allows us to knit ribbing or circular hems. So on either machine we may want to do it. On a Brother, remove the sinker plate, set it aside, and add what is called the ribber arm. Notice that it didn't immediately rock into position for me. That can happen sometimes, so just be sure you wiggle it till it's really secure, and then tighten the nuts. Now when we raise the ribber, this locks into position. But notice I didn't get it raised just right. This is what loosens to raise and lower. There we go. I have a sponge bar sticking out here because I'm using an alternate bar that fits fine, but there's a little bit extra, and since I don't need to close up the machine right now, that's okay. Now we have even spacing all the way across the bed, and just for educational purposes, here is the lever on the other side that I reach for in order to loosen and lower or tighten. Both machines require the use of a cast-on comb and weights for double bed knitting. So this is the comb we'll be using. I've set up for probably the commonest setup, every other needle coming forward on each bed. The pitch is set to P, meaning that if all the needles came out, they'd bump into each other. But they won't, because we're only using every other one on each bed. That is the same on the Superba, except they don't call pitch P. I always think of it on whatever bed as, rackets. Now it's at H. And so even if all come out, they'll alternate. And that's how I look at it. Set the needles so they alternate, or set the needles so they oppose and would hit. And that will keep you from getting confused from machine to machine, because the function is the same. On all machines, we want the first row to have all the needles that are selected knit on both beds. For the Brother, that's achieved with N on the main bed, both N buttons selected over here, and no buttons selected. Also, the last thing I did was Fair Isle, so we need to turn it back to N here. On all machines, the cast-on row, the zigzag row it's called because the yarn will zig and zag, should be at a small stitch size. I'm not going to use 0 for this particular yarn. I think 1 will work better, but it should always be quite a small stitch size on both beds. The yarn is threaded, so we just knit across, and that zigzag row formed. Take the wire out of the comb so that the comb can go underneath and be inserted through those zigzags of yarn. I accidentally split the yarn there, and I just corrected it. We don't need it split. And off to the right where you can't see, I'm starting the wire into the comb. This one's just a hair bent, so it's harder than it needs to be. Fingertips are still holding that comb up. I'll let it go and it'll drop. And now we'll need to hang a weight as close to the center as we are able, feeling around for those holes in the comb. one weight should do for this little bit of knitting. And you probably saw the zigzags pull down a little bit farther as the weight entered them. Now we need to set for circular knitting. This will mean that going to the right, this carriage, the ribber carriage, does not knit. We need the opposite part button on the knitting bed, the main bed. That way, this one knits going to the right, main carriage. This one will still knit going to the left, and we'll get a tubular row. Main bed knitted. Now, I've got a yarn tail down here that's a little bit loose. I'm going to grab a hold of it to prevent any tendency of this stitch to jump off. Front bed knitted. Just what we wanted. Now we can go on to ribbing. We don't want this part button in work anymore. This button over here that says plain cancels all of these buttons, causes them to reset. That's the easy way. And over here we just push to N. And now we select the stitch size we want for ribbing, which in this yarn I think 3 will do me on both beds. About the stitch size settings. Sometimes on Japanese style machines, which this brother is, we do not want to match the numbers, because what we really want to do is match the stitch size. And originally they were not set all the time so that 3 here was the same as 3 here. On mine it is, and on most European machines it is, but that's something that you will need to do some swatching and figure out in order to get balanced ribbing. And now we should just be able to knit. And that's the way we would begin most garments on either machine. So at this point, if this were a real garment, our hem would be complete and we'd be ready usually to transition into stockinette, which, with a very few exceptions, is knitted only on the main bed. On brother machines, that's easier because the main bed is the one that has the main sinker plate, and that makes stockinette knitting much more straightforward. You can continue to knit with the ribber arm on, but if you do, you will need to continue to have quite a lot of weight, and the tendency to drop stitches is higher. So on brother machines and other Japanese machines, if we have the option, we normally knit on the main bed for stockinette. I'm reaching to the left and right and lowering this ribber as far as it will go to get it out of the way. Ribber covers do exist. They look like this. They resemble a piece of house siding, and I've always wondered if that would work. The point of them, you can knit without covering the ribber, and you can use a piece of cloth to do it. But as you lean forward at work, there's a tendency for you and your clothing to get caught on the needles and gate pegs, unless you are very much lankier than I am. So the cover is helpful. Now we want to get off the ribber arm, unthread it, replace it with the main sinker plate, and let's have a look at that. These wheels are one of the reasons why stockinette knits more easily on the main bed. They push down the stitches, they push them in and down. And if you add your weaving brushes, which I don't have on right now, they will add another push down. So for difficult stitches like tuck where the loops build up, adding the weaving brushes is a help. Some people call them the tuck brushes, and I tend to use the terms interchangeably. Always remember to lock the door. It will knit just like this, but occasionally the yarn will pop out without permission, and this we do not want. Generally, we increase the stitch size from ribbing. I'm going to go up to 6, which I've used with this yarn before. Everything's set to in. Nothing special is going on, and we just knit. Knitting back from whole is a useful thing to know because it makes some kinds of cast on and short rowing easier to do. These things are easier to do on a Brother machine than they are on a Superba machine, but I will show you a way to do them on a Superba. The E-wrap cast on, and by the way, this is a quick overview. I have a whole movie called Casting On with the Answer Lady on cast on details, but we'll just hit some highlights here. If we E-wrap and are set to knit back from hold, on a Brother machine, normally it knits perfectly every single stitch, and even without hanging any claw weights, we can normally continue, although it is prudent to hang some. Let's do another row and see. Always make sure there's not too much slack in the yarn. I pulled it out and got some. Yep, knitted beautifully. Let me come over here so you can see what I mean. When I fooled with the yarn, I created some slack here. If you leave that, it will make loops underneath the carriage and cause failed stitches and or jams. So if you have manipulated the yarn, give it a tug upwards and make sure the yarn tension mast is taking up the slack so that you don't get a mess. And here is why we use claw weights. That last one did not want to perfectly knit off. And if I'd had a little weight on it, I wouldn't have had that problem. All the others were perfect. We will save the actual demonstration of fancy stitches for another video, but here's a quick overview. If we wanted to use the punch card, we would go to KC and then knit one plain row, which if there were a card in would cause the needles to select for future rows. Then for tuck, we would depress both tuck buttons. For slip, we would depress the part buttons, and for fair isle, we would depress MC. Sometimes patterns require MC and L, and sometimes they just require MC. The manual for Brothers is pretty explicit, and what I'm telling you is in general true, but there are some other small details. This is a bulky, it's the 260 model, and on this we only have KC. But on some of the other models, the electronics, we have KC1 and KC2. Both of them function to allow the needles to be selected either by your punch card or by your electronic mechanism. But they function slightly differently, and you just have to follow the manual to know which one of them is going to be compatible with the stitch that you're planning to knit. Here are a couple of other useful things to know. This is called hold position. If we switch to H, nothing at all happens to those needles. They're held in that forward position. If we switch to N, they will knit back from hold. Because I have this set on KC, and I don't have a card in, it's selecting all the needles to upper working position. Back to N where it really should be, and they all stay in normal working position. I have brightened this up enormously so that you can get a look at the belt. See what my tool is going behind? Whenever you engage KC, which I will do off to the right now, the belt is engaged. Did you see it move? That's how the selection process works. Now, if I disengage KC, the carriage feels lighter to push because the belt is stationary. I won't go into extreme detail of how that works, but this is what happens, the change, when you select KC. The belt is engaged, and it, by an internal mechanism, transfers the information from card to needle selection. Now let's do all the same things on the Superba. Here's the Superba racking mechanism, and it works in concert with this, which makes the small gradations. So what we want to do is position things so that our needles alternate. This is the lever that if we push it in, it allows the bed to be lowered or raised. On the Superba, you can actually raise it to a super high position, which is not the one I normally use for ribbing. I usually use the normal or level position across the beds. Well, I haven't actually got it. Needles are alternating, beds are level, so we're ready to go. Normal knitting, normal knitting. This is equivalent to the ends on Brother machines. And just as on Brother, we go to a very small stitch size to cast on. Get the zigzag row. There we go. Now we hang the comb and weights. This is pretty much an identical process on every brand of machine that I know that uses this system. The comb goes underneath. You try to keep the center of it centered. It slides up between the zigzags, and you insert the wire. And the comb drops down. Make sure that it does drop down, otherwise that next row won't knit very well, but that's pretty obvious. And on Superbas, as well as everything but pass-ups, absolutely requires weight from this point. And honestly, I even do use it on pass-ups most of the time. On the Superba, this will cause one bed to knit in one direction and the other in the opposite direction. It's corresponding to the part buttons on Brothers. If you did the wrong thing and wanted to change selection, this is the cancel button. Same on both beds. I'm going to raise my stitch size a little for these rows because my zigzag row is pretty tight and I do want them to knit off. And now knit 2 rows. And you can see that one direction the back bed knitted and one direction the front bed knitted. I have already set this almost where I want it, but I'm going to go up just a hair. Being a machine that was designed to be double bed, normally the stitch sizes do match, but it's time to set both beds to knit normally. And we'll go right into ribbing. Now, if this were a real garment, we would probably be ready to transition over to stockinette knitting. This end stitch is not wanting to knit off. I've been having a little trouble with this needle. I'm going to carry on for the video, but I think that, I believe that my needle hook is a little bit twisted and it's trying to split the yarn. So always watch out for things like that on any machine. But we'll move on with the video. Just as on a Brother, the double eye transfer tool is an efficient way to move stitches between beds. Works better if you can see. And you can see, but the camera is sort of between me and my work, so I don't see very well here. Still, it's working. We'll get these all across. And then normally, most Superba knitters continue knitting with both carriages on. The carriages on a Superba are also called chariots or sledges, or sleds, depending on the translation you have of the manual, but it's the same thing as a carriage. And when you think about it, all those words mean the same. And Passup uses the word locks for reasons I don't clearly understand. You do not have to do this, but if we're not going to use the front bed, it's a good idea to disengage all the buttons so you don't accidentally nudge a needle into working position. And back here, we are correctly set. That's the stockinette setting. Usually we go up a little bit on stitch size, sometimes 2 whole numbers, but I didn't knit my ribbing that tightly. So we're ready. So on this machine, it's typical to knit stockinette with both carriages attached. There is something to do that doesn't require you to use both carriages if you have the right implement. And this is it. This is the Superba version of a sinker plate. And to use it, we lower the front bed and get this carriage out of the way and clip this into here. I have an entire video on doing it, so I'll refer you to that video in case you have one of these. It really does make single bed knitting nice. And see, one of the features, that wheel will remind you of what's in the Brother sinker plate, and it should. It has the same effect of controlling the stitches, pushing them in and down so they don't tend to pop off. When you use this, you don't need nearly as much weight. There are a couple of other things you might like to know. With these selectors pointing to the dot and the needles pulled all the way forward to what we call hold position, moving the carriage across doesn't do a thing. It leaves the needles there. If we change it to the upper notation, it also leaves the needles there. That should bring them back to work and return them to knitting in normal working position. These selectors are the same on both beds and the same on both sides of the machine. If you preferred to cast on so that you have an E-wrap or a chain stitch edge at the bottom of your knitting on a Superba, it's better to start with waste yarn. So I'm going to knit onwards from here. You would cast on as we just did in your waste yarn, double bed style, because that works so well, and knit a few rows of a yarn that contrasted with your main yarn. I'm using black here. And the reason for that is that this machine, unless you do have that special piece, is not going to knit back from E-wrap or chain stitch very well unless there is already weight on it. So this allows us to put the weight down here in our waste yarn. I'm actually leaving the weight in the first demo piece, and we're calling that our waste yarn. Now I can lower the beds just so I have some elbow room, bring forward the needles, and E-wrap just as I showed you on the Brother machine. The secret with E-wrap is get the E-wraps neat and on every needle, but not overly tight. The reason being that the machine will have a lot of trouble knitting through them if we over tighten. So I typically control with my thumb. If you had to do it just with your right hand, you'd have to pull it awfully tight to keep from losing it. These E's like to uncoil. But if I capture them after making them gently and not too tightly, I don't have to tighten them as much, and the machine will have an easier time knitting them. So drop the tail between the beds and thread this into the carriage. I'm going to close up the beds, even though I'm not going to knit on the front bed. The carriages just work better like that. We're set in the position that should knit back from hold. And there we go. Let's knit just a few rows and then have a look. Here's our swatch. You can see the row of E-wraps from the purl side. And when I remove this waste yarn, there should be a nice, neat closed cast on. It would also be a nice, neat closed cast on if I had used chain stitch where we used E-wraps. But I would have used the same technique. In this case, my black waste yarn was slick enough and strong enough that I knew I could just tug and get it out. In many cases, that's not actually true, and what you would do then is knit your waste yarn rows followed by a single row of ravel cord, which is usually nylon, thin, very strong, and very slippery, and then proceed to the E-wrap cast on or the chain stitch cast on. That ravel cord pulls out of the knitting even more easily than my black waste yarn did. So if you're dealing with a fuzzy or more delicate yarn, it's the quicker way to get it off of your main knitting.